Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome again to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we look at important scientific ideas to help equip you to be more confident in the truth of Christianity so that you go tell others. Today I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Sean McDowell, and we're going to just ask the question, what does he think is the strongest evidence for the truth of Christianity? Sean, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Enjoy interacting. I got to say, it's neat talking to you, knowing the impact that your dad had in my life. He was one of the two top apologists, if you will, in my life.
So who's the other? Now I need to know.
Hugh Ross is the other one.
Of course.
Of course. But no, it's great to have you here and talk to you. And I know you've kind of taken up in your father's tradition and look at how do you defend the Christian faith and spread that. And so I know we're here on set at AMP conference. We work down here near Biola, where you're a professor of apologetics there. And so I'll just throw the question to you. I know you're talking about this a little bit tonight. What are some of the things that you can do to talk to people about the truth of Christianity?
That's a great question. You mentioned my father. So one of the arguments that I heard a lot growing up, and he popularized in his book More Than a Carpenter, was related to the apostles' willingness to die for their faith, that they had seen the risen Jesus. Always struck me as reasonable, always struck me as a good argument. Why would somebody die for something they knew was false? Well, a few years ago, I was with a group of students at Berkeley, high school students, and we invited in an atheist to speak to our group. And one of my students goes, wait a minute, you don't even think Jesus existed. Why would the apostles die if he didn't exist? And he looks back at us and he goes, give me any evidence they actually died as martyrs. And my students kind of looked at me and I thought, I actually really don't know the answer to that. I should. I've always taken it for granted. I've heard it a million times, so have you. And I thought, you know what, I was actually looking for a PhD dissertation at that time. So I spent 3 years researching that. And I've come to believe that we've sometimes exaggerated that argument. We can't prove that all the apostles died as martyrs, even minus John. But here's what we know. We know they believed because they thought they'd seen the risen Jesus. And we know they were willing to suffer and die for this. And we know, in fact, that some of the apostles with good early evidence actually did. And there's no evidence any of them recanted. So this doesn't prove Christianity's true, but this shows this wasn't a conspiracy. They weren't making it up for personal gain. They wrote down and reported and shared, related to them truly believing they had seen the risen Jesus.
So let me press into that a little bit. You know, one of the key things of a scientific investigation is there's got to be evidence. You can make up whatever theory you want,
That's right.
But how do you test it? So what is some of the evidence that really does show that at least some of them were martyred and that they were willing to go to the cross, or not go to the cross, but willing to die for their belief that Jesus rose from the dead?
To pick up their cross, like I said. Of the 12, and Paul and James, I think there's 4 we can have confidence died as martyrs. There's 2 that are at least more probable than not.
Okay.
I would say Peter and Paul, and then James, the brother of Jesus, James, the son of Zebedee.
Okay.
Now, the leading apostle who's quoted more times in the scriptures, and that there's the best evidence for, is Peter.
Okay.
So we have 2 first-century writings, one at the end of John 21, where Jesus says, your hands will be spread out, and it's described how he would die. That's in the 90s, a Christian source. Then you have Clement of Rome, the end of the 1st century, probably written in the 90s. And then there's 8 other sources in the 2nd century to greater and lesser strength and clarity, but unanimously and consistently tell us that Peter died as a martyr.
And so the idea that those are the 2nd century kind of puts it up close to when it actually happened as opposed to being some legend that developed, presumably.
Yeah, I did my investigation on really the 1st and 2nd century. When you go up towards the end of the 2nd century, you get past kind of this 3rd generation of what's called living testimony passed on. So I thought, I'm going to put the greatest amount of historical worth, so to speak, on sources that are 1st and 2nd century. And it's unanimous when it comes to Peter. So it's early, it's consistent, especially when you compare it with other historical kinds of documents. That number is pretty solid that we can conclude Peter really died as a martyr.
That's remarkable. So I've got to ask you, one of the things that I've always heard, that now that I have somebody who's got the expertise, always heard that Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified like Christ. Is that one of those exaggerations, or does that stand up under scrutiny?
The earliest reference to him being crucified upside down shows in a document called the Acts of Peter, probably AD 180 or 190.
Okay.
Now, it's filled with all this other legendary material, but it's based around a historical core. Now, you've probably heard the same that I heard from other people being in church, that he didn't want to be crucified like Jesus and requested to be crucified upside down out of humility. Do you really think the Romans took suggestions how you wanted to be crucified, right?
The moment I asked that of this question, I'm like, why would the Romans care what you thought?
Like, they don't care.
Right.
So the point was, actually, the world had been turned upside down, according to this document, and that Peter could see it upside down, and then his death would help turn it right side up, in the way kind of mirroring Jesus' death. So we do know that there are some people who could be crucified upside down. It's not impossible. But later church historians in the 3rd and 4th century start relying upon the Acts of Peter as if it's historical. And I take a step back, I say it's not impossible, but I don't think we can include in any kind of rigorous historical or scientific investigation that this is most likely what happened.
So it sounds like there is some, as you go back and push into that, there are some, not apocryphal or legendary or kind of flowery things that are interesting to discuss and talk about, but there is really some hard evidence that there were disciples of Christ that were martyred because of their belief in Christ.
That's right.
So you mentioned Peter. Can you just kind of rehash? What were the other ones that we're pretty confident of?
Paul. We have one 1st century source in Clement of Rome, and then we have 7 other 2nd century sources. Again, early, consistent, unanimous, that Paul died as a martyr. When you come to James, the brother of Jesus, you have 6 sources, 1st and 2nd century. But what's interesting about James is you have Christian sources, you have Gnostic sources, and you have a Jewish source, Josephus. So this range of different sources, to me, gives more historical credibility.
Be harder to pull off a conspiracy across those sorts of
I think it would be. It's just multiply attested. And then James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John, is actually in Acts 12 too. So if Acts is reliable, and there's a very good case that can be made, and you also read it in Acts 12, it reads like a straightforward execution account, no flowery details, that tells me it might not be as strong as Peter where we have multiple sources, but that is almost certainly more historically probable than not.
So as we're wrapping up here, what does this actually get us to? Does this mean that Christianity is true? So we don't overstate the case. What is this? What do we need to be aware of when we're using this to talk to people?
So I'm so glad you asked this, because even any scientific finding from, say, like DNA doesn't prove the Christian God exists. It challenges naturalism and points towards some mind. Well, this evidence doesn't prove that Christianity is true. It doesn't prove the resurrection happened. It could be that the apostles had hallucinations. Like, that's possible. We still have to rule that out. All this shows is they really believed they had seen the risen Jesus, and they were willing to suffer and die for that conviction. They didn't intentionally make up this story to get themselves persecuted and some of them martyred. So I think it shows that they're not liars. They really believe this and are willing to put their lives on the line for the depths of that conviction.
It seems like that it really establishes one of those pieces of evidence that points to the truth of the resurrection, but it doesn't actually establish that it happened, if you will.
It is a part of a bigger case for the resurrection. It alone doesn't get us there, but I think it's one piece. Today there's so much fake news. There's so many people that lie to get out of trouble and have personal gain. I want to ask people, if the apostles really made this up, why do you think they made it up? That's a good question, at least, to get people thinking.
Well, thanks, Sean. I appreciate your comments.
You bet.
You know, our claim and our stance and our position at RTB is that there really is strong evidence to support the truth of the Christian faith. And one of those central claims of the Christian faith is that Jesus rose from the dead. The idea that many disciples of Christ were willing to die to attest to that is a powerful evidence in support of Christianity. You know, I would encourage you to go check out SeanMcDowell.org. There's a lot of resources you can pick up there, but one of them that is very powerful is a resource called Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the 2nd edition, and it has a chapter that talks about the evidence for the apostles' martyrdom in support of Christ's resurrection. Pick that up so you can be equipped to share the gospel with those God brings across your path.